as in debate, speaking the right words makes all the difference. And that's why we wouldn't let governments set up schools to teach endangered indigenous languages. We're going to talk about 3 constructive arguments on our side today. First of all, why it hurts the education of our children. Second, why this creates social antagonism. And third, my second speaker will show how it distorts parental decision-making over their children's education. But let's first establish our position in terms of a model. We think endangered indigenous languages can be protected by other means, including linguistic documentation, cultural activities, museums, or even inclusion in national symbols. We just disagree with side proposition's approach of setting up schools for this specific purpose. We think endangered indigenous languages are endangered right because they're functionally irrelevant in the rest of society. We think it's thus irresponsible to force governments to set up schools that teach endangered and indigenous languages which don't prepare the majority of students for life. We think there are precedents of successful protection of such languages without that policy, no thank you, in the protection of indigenous Malay and Borneo tribe languages in Southeast Asia. Before we move further into our constructive argument, let's assess their case by asking 2 questions. First, is their model reasonable? Second, do they really help society? So let's first talk about their model. Granted, they talked about UNESCO standards without really explaining them. They talked about how we want to exclude certain languages that have only one or a few other people talking about, using them. The point is, endangered indigenous languages aren't like languages like Malay, for example, which are spoken by 20% of Singapore's population or a larger portion of Malaysia's population. We're talking about languages which are spoken by under 1% of most countries. So in these cases, no thank you, it's really hard to promote social interaction, it's really hard to promote cultural interaction using these languages, and in fact it's precisely, no thank you, dangerous when they're talking about starting at primary schools, because we say they want to talk about an option for national languages, but at the same time, if people have a really bad foundation in their national languages, because maths, creative thinking, and literacy are all taught in endangered and indigenous languages by their policy, then it's going to hurt, no thank you, their future educational prospects in secondary and tertiary education. We think that it's fundamentally dangerous, and that's why their model undercuts their principle. Let's now talk about helping society. And here, they basically talked about diversity and representation. But it's really interesting, because we're not talking about democratic legislature, for example. We're talking about the education of our children, where education isn't about, no thank you, a means of preserving culture. It's a means of preparing our students to deal with future challenges in a competitive, globalized world where functionally most people have to speak English for commerce and for science. Hold a moment. We think that they say there's a certain claim of choice to go to normal schools, but that doesn't exist because there's huge pressure on the part of these minorities to force children into such schools to preserve the culture, as they say, and that's going to impact the future of those children. Why would you let them suffer?
If you concede to the fact that languages are dying right now in the status quo, how are you saying that current mechanisms are effective in preserving those languages?
We say that they might be dying, but that only suggests that we can step up the linguistic documentation, step up the cultural activities. It's not a matter of adopting your policy as a consequence. We challenge the next speaker to explain that. Then we talk about how the government, no thank you, must be the actor to do this. We disagree because we think that the government today in the United States, for example, isn't the same government, no thank you, that persecuted minorities in the past. And we think minorities, no thank you, are going to be hurt even further if you let their children study languages that don't prepare them for real careers in real life. So we think all their arguments about representation, no thank you, are fundamentally fallacious because it's about education in these cases. It's not saying that minority communities don't have a right to use their language, don't have a right to speak in that language. It's a question of whether or not we're going to use it in education. And I'm now going to move into my substantive argument, which further undercuts their case about hurting the education of our children. Here, our thesis is that schools should not be set up by the government to teach endangered indigenous languages because they don't give children the functional skills they need for life. Now, state-funded education is very different from the private sector, say, setting up its own schools for endangered indigenous languages, which is still possible, which answers further, no thank you, their case about representation. It's about preparing students for the future challenges in a globalized world. Why? Because the government is voted in by the people to promote social progress as a whole. So even as students are given some autonomy, the state only permits you to choose, no thank you, within a prescribed curriculum. That's why in Asian schools, for example, you don't study Latin or basket weaving because there's no future use for such skills. We think it's exactly the same, no thank you, when we're talking about endangered indigenous languages. Because you can't use it when you actually have to go to work, and that's what education is supposed to prepare you for. For example, children in Peru who studied in schools that taught in the endangered indigenous language Quechua were forced to relearn Spanish just to get jobs. It also hurts other subjects and their skills as well, because of an established linguistic theory known as the Sapir-Whorf theory, which suggests that some languages have concepts in maths and science, like in English for example, that aren't transferable. No thank you, over to indigenous languages. So for instance, no thank you, in the endangered indigenous Russian language Chuvash, it's not possible to express concepts like photosynthesis and electrons, which are basic scientific concepts anyone needs to grasp. So we think your scientific skills are going to be hurt. Why aren't they, sir?
Sir, how hard is it to explain 1 + 1 = 2 in a different language?
The question is whether or not you're able to explain it in an endangered indigenous language if it doesn't fundamentally contain these concepts, because most of the time it's dying out because, no thank you, it can't contain such concepts, so you need to explain your link in logical terms. Furthermore, there's huge opportunity costs created by governments being made to set up such schools. Because there are very few speakers, so it's hard to find teachers who are qualified. The materials are going to be really expensive, even if they are so-called scholarly organizations to standardize them according to proposition. And we must replace the teachers really fast, as many are already very old. Fewer than 1,000 people speak the Lento language in West Ukraine, and most of them are over the age of 60. So there's a huge opportunity cost when the state has to spend loads of money on endangered and indigenous language schools, causing the rest of the state system to suffer. Especially since the debate is going to focus on developing countries like Gabon, which have over 40 different endangered indigenous languages but are seriously indebted and can't even provide for basic literacy skills. No thank you. And that's why we think it would hurt the education of our children to adopt that policy. Let's look at the second issue of creating social antagonism. Our thesis is that governments setting up schools to teach in indigenous, endangered languages results in the isolation and enclaving of such groups. Now, inherent to endangered indigenous languages is the fact that few speakers use it in society. So if the whole education of a child for his primary school formative years are going to be in this language, he isn't able to develop formative skills in interacting with other people. Even if it's just one subject among many, they still want to teach the national language, the time spent on it means you compromise your ability to speak in the national language. That's why there are really bad scores for Berbers when it comes to Arabic, the main national language in Algeria, for example. Furthermore, they're going to feel alienated from society, and they're going to set up their own enclaves, shut off from the rest of our community, raising racial tensions and reducing understanding. Let's look at recent clashes in October 2011 between the transitional government in Libya and the minority Berber community whose language is only spoken by under 10,000 people. Furthermore, what happens with endangered indigenous languages in schools is that they raise social inequality because they tend to be used by the poorest parts of society. That's why if government sets up such schools, minority communities in Sweden, like the Sami, end up suffering because they can't get jobs and can't get a livelihood. Thus, we've shown that allowing governments to use schools to teach endangered and indigenous languages fundamentally hurts society and hurts the future of all our children. Stand with opposition.